Hello everybody, my name is LHttFL, and welcome to the official analysis video for Long Haul to the Far Lands. I already have a feeling there's going to be a whole lot of cuts in this, so try to bear with me. But what you heard were the Westminster chimes. They mark the top of the hour, and it's the symbolism for that will be how they also mark every 25% mark of the whole journey to the Far Lands. This was simply the beginning here. I intentionally used the Westminster chimes to keep track of the time during my 10-hour streams. The whole music piece was designed to work as 4 standalone tracks, 1 hour-long album, and as a 10-hour loop track. Starting out with segment 1, the soft piano is the primary piece, just like most of my other work. And just like the start of the walk to the Far Lands, it starts out pretty slow. You know, as with every journey, when you're just starting out, it's gonna feel slow just because of how much farther there is to go. The violin in the background helps set up the overall mood. And moving on forward, after this loops several times, at bar 52, only the Taishi Koto remains, allowing for some time to breathe before it gets back into the next repetition of what we have heard. At segment 2, the soft piano is joined by a concert piano, and shortly after, a bright piano. It is the calm before the storm, as only the concert piano remains, because once that all wraps up, everything we have heard up until this point all comes back together. So that repeats on for several more times, then moving on towards the end of this segment. Everything fades away as it makes preparation for the next segment that arrives. The soft piano returns, but this time it has a more uplifting tune to it. After some time has passed during the walk, you think back with happiness at how far you've traveled. Even if it's only early on in the adventure, there are still times when you think back at how far you've traveled during the journey throughout. And then as you can hear, the bright piano also returns. So then moving on ahead, after this will fade away. Starting at segment 5, the original piano returns as there is a bittersweet feeling of how far you've already walked, but with how much more walking there is to go. Toms have been brought in to help with sudden spark of motivation whilst walking. Because there are times just when you just have this general excitement in terms of how much more there is to go, or I should say, general excitement of wanting to continue on despite there being a lot more to go. This will always come and go as with every journey. By now, only the Taishi Koto and the Toms remain, as some of the energy from before fades away, leaving only a trace of the feeling that was once present before. So, moving on to the end of that segment. The original piano returns and brings some sadness with it as you realize that you're just barely reaching the 25 mark. However, the toms provide the motivation to continue on, but the piano still looms overhead. Despite knowing that you are coming upon the 25% mark, there is still the fact that there is still a long ways to go. The quarter mark of the Westminster chimes is heard, which represents the passing of 15 real-world minutes. With segment 1 of part 2, SFXR sets a new stage. It is slow, to represent how passing the 25% mark of the Farlands walk feels really slow, as you realize just how much farther there is left to go. The space voice appears to provide a more ambient environment for the real world person at the computer as on their walk. Honestly, I don't really have a full explanation for this particular sound used, other than I thought it sounded good and it happened to fit the digital feel of SFXR. And so I ended up including it, along with some more backgrounds provided from some violins. On segment 2, starting with just the space voice, a honky tonk is brought in to provide a little more drama while having some breathing room before SFXR makes its return. At this point, the honky tonk has effectively replaced the violin from segment 1, so instead of feeling moodiness, it brings tension. And after the 25% mark of the Farlands journey, any sort of tension from an outside source can occur. Much real world time has already passed just because of how long it takes in order to make it to the Farlands. Once you reach the 25% mark, it's already been a while since you've started out in the real world. And so at the end of this segment, the space voice and the honky tonk fade out in preparation for what is to come next. SFXR once again sets a new stage. This segment is a recreation of Ordinary Morning, the signature track from Population Zelanator. Drums and an organ accompany SFXR to help complete the full tune of Ordinary Morning. But instead of having a piano be the centerpiece, SFXR takes that role compared to the original. It is also a slower tempo than what Ordinary Morning was. Otherwise, all the notes remain identical to how they were. The familiarity of the tune from Ordinary Morning is replaced by some of the sadness from the start of Part 2 that the original tune that SFXR was playing. Although the other instruments remain, the sadness from SFXR has faded away. It has been replaced with a general melancholic feel of the space voice. After walking for so long, doing this tedious task has become quite tiring. Much time has passed, but the end is still so far away. This is definitely the part where you are feeling a more grindy aspect of it, doing the same thing over and over, yet it feels like you're not getting anywhere. For segment 7, SFXR, the space voice, drums, and the organ all come together to just provide an overall general feeling of unhappiness. There will be long moments of the walk where you're feeling just not very happy. No happiness to be found after doing the same thing for many, many hours on end. For this segment, the general melancholy of the space voice has morphed into an energy to keep going. This motivation can be coming from any sort of outside source during the journey. The mood picks up here, as there is happiness in seeing the halfway mark coming up just ahead. At bar 659, the honky tonk returns, but with a more uplifting tone. It is eagerly awaiting the halfway mark of the Farlands journey. At bar 697, only the honky tonk remains, but the rest of the energy that accompanied it has faded away. For segment 9, the sadness of SFXR has returned. There's still a lot of distance left to go. However, though, that does not last long. SFXR and the honky tonk provide an overall mixed mood as they set up for the halfway mark. There's a little bit of sadness because of how much distance there is left to go, but at the same time, you've still traveled quite a long ways in order to make it to this point. Right about as you started getting a little bit tired of the repetition from SFXR and the honky tonk, the entire tone changes. This was originally an accident. While I was copying and pasting notes, they ended up being slightly off. It was while I was copying and pasting the honky tonk down here, because as you can see, it's all one long collection of notes. But because I thought it sounded good, I ended up keeping it. And in the final moments, the feelings that SFXR brought all fade away, and only the energy of the honky tonk remains upon reaching the halfway mark of the journey. The halfway mark of the Westminster chimes is heard, which represents the passing of 30 real-world minutes, and would also correlate to reaching the halfway mark of the Farlands journey in total. At the very beginning of this segment, it is very similar to real-world Westminster chimes, marking the 3 o'clock hour, with the 3 bell tolls. The church bells are the prominent instrument of this part. They are meant to be grandiose, just as passing the halfway mark of the adventure is a significant accomplishment. The concert piano returns, but is merely as a backup instrument. At bar 798, each of the 2 instruments gets their own time to be in the spotlight alone before setting up for a timpani to add emphasis to each ring of the bells. And then towards the end of the segment, the original beat of the timpani falls apart as it makes way for a slower one. By now, the thrill of reaching the halfway mark fades away as the regular grind is back on again. At this point, all the excitement of reaching the halfway mark, that's all going away now. And the only thing that's left is the sadness of how much more there is to go. A combination of the slow beat of the timpani and the slow ringing of the church bells. You can feel the slowness of being back on the usual grind again on the journey. For segment 3, the whole tune speeds up with a sudden burst of motivation to keep pressing forward, despite there still being a long journey left to travel. As with most people, our moods will fluctuate throughout the day and throughout adventures for not really any big reason. So, this sudden burst of motivation can be coming from any sort of outside effect. I tried to get human emotion into this by having the mood shifts throughout the entire length of this. There's a lot of ups and downs for times of sadness and times for motivation to keep going. The piano in the background of the bells and the timpani are just another reminder of a little bit of the feeling of how much more there is left to go, even though a long distance has been traveled so far. The excitement from the previous burst of inspiration has now faded away. Things are calmer now, but there is still anticipation for the end of the journey coming up. Bells make a return. They emphasize the anticipation that the concert piano has. The bells shift to provide the grandiose tune from before, leading up to the 75% mark. The piano fades away, and only the bells ring out in the final moment for this part. But they too also fade away as we reach the 3/4 mark. The 3/4 mark of the Westminster chimes is heard, which represents the passing of 45 real minutes, and also reaching the 75% mark of the journey to the far lands. The journey has reached the last quarter of travel time to go. However, there is not yet excitement. Instead, there is only thoughtful reflection on how far you've come. The music box provides a somewhat melancholic atmosphere, and the harp adds to that. The tune of the music box changes to ease some of the melancholy that is floating around as the underlying harp remains the same. For segment 3, the music box and harp have come to an end as the glockenspiel takes over. I really hope I'm saying that right. It provides the energy to continue pressing forward, despite the journey thus far being a slow, painful task. Bells and the harp can be heard once more, but their purpose is to amplify the energy that the glockenspiel provides. The energy from the previous part has died down. Only fatigue from the long journey remains. The harp and glockenspiel reflect that feeling of sluggishness. This would represent the time in the journey when you know you're getting close to the end, but there's still a fair amount of ways to travel, and it just feels like things are going by pretty slowly. The sluggishness of the glockenspiel has faded away. What I consider to be dueling harps takes control over the mood. There's a battle going on between the motivation to continue to press forward in the final stretch and the fatigue of traveling the distance up until this point. The concept of what dueling harps would sound like just sort of popped into my head, and then I went for it, and I think it turned out well, and thus I ended up including it in the final version. In segment 6, the first tune of the music box and harp return. It is the lingering thoughtfulness of making it this far in the journey. However, the glockenspiel and church bell are present that give the last bit of strength to carry onward. This segment represents the feeling of it all comes down to this, because at this point we are nearing the end of this music track as a whole, and we are getting close to the grand finale of the Walk to the Farlands. For segment 7, the one ring of the bells sounds out. It is the hard hitting realization that this journey is just about over, and by now, the music box represents any final thoughts that's going on through your head in those last moments of this journey. The harp, like at the beginning of this part, adds to the moodiness of the music box. However, though, that fades away right before the final destination is reached. The Westminster chimes mark the top of the hour, as well as the end of the journey. It is over. As a new hour starts, where you go from here is up to you. Just like how it is the start of a new hour, it is now the start of what will you do next. And so I hope y'all enjoyed my thorough analysis and breakdown of this whole music track and why I made it as it is. Sorry if a few things ended up feeling a little bit rushed. This recording session is coming upon the whole hour's worth. But if you have any further questions or comments, feel free to leave it down below. And so I believe that is all it for what I wanted to say. Thank you all for watching. Bye.